Under the burning Texas sun of March 1944, the landscape shimmered like a mirage. A train slowed to a groaning halt on the dusty tracks near the small town of Herne. Inside its iron belly, hundreds of German prisoners sat silent, sweat dripping down their faces, uniforms faded from the African desert. Their eyes darted through barred windows, expecting chains, dogs, and cold hostility. Instead, they saw neat rows of wooden huts, a canteen, and what looked like a football field stretching inside a fenced perimeter, an image so alien it left them in disbelief. An American sergeant shouted, "Welcome to Camp Herne!" The tone was firm but not cruel, as if discipline here carried a strange sense of respect. As the Germans stepped onto the soil of their captivity, they braced for humiliation. Yet the guards didn't sneer. They didn't strike. Instead, they offered water, cigarettes, and paperwork. One lieutenant muttered to another that perhaps this was some kind of psychological trick. These men had been told that capture by the enemy meant starvation and torture. But now, as their boots sank into Texas dust, a bewildering realization dawned. This was not vengeance. It was administration, even civility. A young corporal whispered, "If this is war, it feels like no war I've known." That same afternoon, the camp's loudspeakers crackled to life. The message echoed in clear, clipped English. The prisoners would be treated under the Geneva Convention. They would work, study, and live with dignity, as long as they respected camp rules. To the men of the once feared Africa Corps, it sounded like fiction. They had been taught to see Americans as reckless brutes, industrial warriors without honor. But the reality of Camp Herne challenged every rumor of barbarity. The irony was sharp. America was fighting the ideology of tyranny by demonstrating freedom inside a prison fence. The camp itself looked like an organized frontier village. Barracks were lined with military precision. Whitewashed fences divided living sections, and a flagpole stood tall in the center square. The guards carried rifles, but walked with an ease that puzzled their captives. From the watchtowers they observed, but they did not provoke. When the sun fell, lamps glowed across the camp like a small city holding its breath in the night. German officers took note of the efficiency, the cleanliness, the order, the almost mechanical rhythm of the place. Some murmured with reluctant admiration that America had engineered captivity with the same precision it built tanks. Within weeks, an unexpected conversation began. A group of German non-commissioned officers requested permission to elect a spokesman to mediate disputes within the camp. To their astonishment, the American commander agreed. Ballots were drawn up. Names were nominated. The prisoners voted in secret, their first free election in years. When the results were announced, cheers rippled through the compound. For a moment, the men felt something they hadn't known under the Reich agency. The Americans had, intentionally or not, allowed their prisoners to rediscover the concept of representation. What began as a modest gesture soon evolved into a structured form of self-rule. The Germans established councils to handle discipline, education, and recreation. The Americans supervised but rarely interfered. The prisoners were given lumber and tools to repair their own barracks, and soon they built furniture, theaters, and even small gardens. A camp newsletter appeared, written by German editors and approved by US censors. The paper included essays, jokes, and announcements of upcoming lectures. "And we built a world within a fence," one prisoner later recalled. It was as though captivity had become a laboratory for rebuilding their shattered sense of order. Beyond the wire, local Texans watched curiously. Farmers drove by in pickup trucks, staring at the German soldiers playing soccer behind the fences. Children whispered stories that Nazis live in a Texas town, yet many locals felt a strange sympathy. Some even offered fresh bread or newspapers through the fence. America, vast and confident in victory, had room for magnanimity. In those fields, the war seemed distant, and the enemy looked less like monsters and more like young men far from home. Inside the camp, days became routine. Morning roll calls, work assignments, language classes. The YMCA supplied books and instruments. Soon orchestras formed, voices sang hymns in the evening, and debates filled the barracks late into the night. Mathematics, philosophy, and even political theory were taught by former professors and engineers among the prisoners. For men raised in dictatorship, this intellectual freedom felt intoxicating. Yet it was not without danger. Within this small republic, Old loyalties lingered like ghosts. Hardcore Nazis formed secret circles to preserve the Reich's ideals. They painted swastikas in hidden corners, spread rumors of Germany's coming victory, and denounced anyone who questioned the Führer's will. By contrast, moderates and weary soldiers began to think differently. They saw the Americans' trust as a mirror of the society their own leaders had destroyed. They noticed that the guards didn't need to shout to maintain authority. One prisoner noted quietly to his cellmate that discipline built on respect was stronger than one built on fear. But such words were whispered carefully, for spies still lurked among them. In one barrack, a sergeant caught reading an English textbook was accused of treason by fellow prisoners. The self-governing council, once a symbol of freedom, became a battleground between democracy and fanaticism. Still, the camp's structure endured. The Americans preferred to let the prisoners manage their own order, believing it reduced unrest. The system worked astonishingly well. Work crews repaired roads, cleaned facilities, and even volunteered to harvest cotton on nearby farms. Each man was paid in camp coupons, redeemable for cigarettes and soap. For many, labor became therapy, a chance to feel human again. A few guards began to see their captives as equals. One Texan corporal later said, "They worked like men who wanted to rebuild their souls." But beneath the calm, tensions smoldered. The outside world was changing fast. Allied troops had landed in Normandy. The Red Army was closing on Berlin, and Hitler's empire was burning from within. News arrived through Red Cross bulletins, smuggled newspapers and rumors. The men gathered in hushed circles, reading about bombings in Cologne and Dresden, their faces pale under lantern light. Some wept quietly. Others clenched their fists in defiance. One officer vowed that the Reich would rise again. Another whispered that Germany must learn from its conquerors, not curse them. As autumn came, the air cooled, and with it, the camp's mood. An invisible divide grew between those still bound by the Führer's faith and those ready to move on. The Americans watched closely, but stayed hands-off, believing the Germans needed to confront themselves. And they did. The so-called self-government became both a test and a mirror. Within it, Germans faced their own ideology, whether it would break or bend under freedom. By winter, when Christmas arrived, the camp choir sang carols that mixed German melody with English harmony. Guards listened in silence, the sound drifting beyond the fence into the open Texas night. In that strange harmony, the war seemed to blur for a few fleeting moments. The men realized something profound, that dignity could exist even in defeat, and humanity could survive even behind barbed wire. Yet no one knew what would come next. Beyond the fence, ships waited to carry them back to a broken homeland. Would these men carry home the lessons of democracy, born in captivity, or the bitterness of lost empire? The answer was uncertain, and as the lights dimmed across Camp Herne, the prisoners looked out toward the horizon, knowing freedom was near, but wondering what freedom now meant. The secret behind Camp Herne's astonishing transformation lay not in ideology, but in logistics and psychology. America's approach to handling its German captives was a calculated fusion of military efficiency and moral strategy. By 1944, over 400,000 German prisoners were scattered across the United States, each a potential source of unrest or redemption. The War Department understood that brute confinement would only breed rebellion. Instead, it chose something revolutionary: controlled liberty. The key principle was simple: treat men as men, not as enemies, and watch the results. It was a gamble that few in Europe would have dared to make. Inside the fences of Herne, that philosophy was tested daily. The American guards had strict orders: maintain order through respect, not intimidation. Each prisoner was addressed by rank, their military dignity intact. Rations mirrored those of U.S. soldiers: bread, meat, vegetables, even coffee. Such equality baffled the Germans, who expected cruelty. To them, this civility felt more dangerous than punishment. It disarmed their hatred. As one captured lieutenant noted in a report, the Americans conquer not by the whip, but by reason. This principle, rooted in the Geneva Convention, but expanded by American pragmatism, became the invisible weapon that reshaped minds more effectively than propaganda ever could. The experiment deepened when the Germans began governing themselves. The structure they built inside Herne was astonishingly complex. The elected Lagerführer, camp leader, oversaw multiple departments: sanitation, food supply, education, and discipline. Beneath him, committees managed law, culture, and sports. Each decision required debate, voting, and consensus. Unwittingly, these former soldiers, many of whom had lived under Nazi absolutism, were practicing democratic process for the first time. Their guards watched from afar as these men, trained to obey, slowly learned to deliberate. At the heart of this change lay the camp's educational program. With the support of the YMCA's War Prisoner Aid Division, the Americans provided libraries stocked with textbooks, novels, and political treatises. German professors, captured in Tunisia and Italy, taught classes in history, mathematics, and literature. In one classroom, a captured engineer lectured on the design of the V-2 rocket, explaining propulsion and guidance with chalk on a cracked blackboard. The guards took notes too, fascinated by their captives' expertise. When the lectures ended, prisoners debated not weapons but ethics. Could science be separated from morality? The discussion echoed late into the night. The Americans, listening from outside, realized the camp had become more than a prison. It was a university built from war. Yet beneath this intellectual renaissance, danger lurked. Among the thousands of POWs were hardline Nazis, men who saw self-rule as treason. They organized secretly, calling themselves the Schwarze Korps or Black Corps. Their mission was to preserve loyalty to the Führer and crush dissent. They threatened moderate prisoners, circulated coded messages, and painted swastikas in hidden corners of the barracks. American intelligence suspected these factions, but hesitated to intervene, believing internal conflict would expose the fractures of the Reich itself. The gamble proved costly. In October 1944, tensions erupted. During a council meeting, a young private named Emil Markmann spoke out, claiming Germany's downfall was inevitable and that Hitler had betrayed his own people. Hours later, Markmann was found dead behind the camp's laundry building, a rope around his neck. Officially, it was suicide. Unofficially, everyone knew it was murder. The Americans launched an investigation, but met a wall of silence. The camp's democracy had produced its first martyr. From that night onward, the illusion of unity within the self-governing system cracked. The Americans responded subtly. Instead of dissolving the experiment, they reinforced it, tightening oversight while urging moderate prisoners to lead by example. They organized sports tournaments, concerts, and joint projects that paired German labor with American supervision. In one such project, prisoners repaired farm machinery for Texas farmers, demonstrating mechanical skill that astonished locals. The collaboration blurred the line between captive and civilian. An old farmer later recalled, "They fixed my tractor, then thanked me for the chance to work. I'd never seen pride like that in men behind barbed wire." Technological factors played their part too. The camp's infrastructure, though modest, was a marvel of wartime engineering. Water pumps, sewage systems, and power lines were maintained by the prisoners themselves under U.S. Army supervision. Every tool from shovels to typewriters was accounted for. Nothing went to waste. The efficiency mirrored America's broader wartime industrial machine. The same precision that built Liberty ships and Sherman tanks was reflected in the way it managed its captives. Where Germany had weaponized ideology, America had weaponized organization. Communication inside the camp became its own kind of battlefield. Radios were forbidden, yet the prisoners found ways to receive news from Europe, sometimes through smuggled notes from sympathetic guards, other times through newspapers brought in by farm employers. As the headlines grew darker, Berlin bombed, the Eastern Front collapsing, the prisoners' political arguments intensified. Some broke down in tears when they read of their families' suffering. Others hardened into denial, clinging to rumors of secret weapons that would turn the tide. At night, debates in the barracks grew heated, voices echoing against tin walls. One American observer wrote in his journal that, "Within those fences, the war continues in minds and words, not bullets." In December 1944, as the Battle of the Bulge raged in Europe, Camp Herne's ideological battle reached its own climax. A group of anti-Nazi prisoners proposed rewriting the camp's internal charter to remove references to the Reich and introduce democratic principles. The vote was chaotic, nearly violent. Shouts of "traitor" and "patriot" split the crowd. The Americans watched, realizing they were witnessing Germany's future in miniature, a people torn between obedience and conscience. When the vote finally passed by a narrow margin, cheers erupted. The camp, for the first time, had chosen democracy. The aftermath was remarkable. Once the hardliners saw that the Guards supported the moderates, open defiance dwindled. A new tone spread through Herne. Theater groups performed plays by Goethe and Schiller, instead of Nazi propaganda. Painters decorated the walls with landscapes of Bavaria and the Rhine. A small orchestra performed Beethoven's Eroica Symphony, its dedication to freedom newly meaningful. The camp became a cultural enclave, echoing with music and debate even as the real world outside collapsed into ruin. The Guards, once mere custodians, found themselves changed too. Many confessed after the war that the Germans' discipline and craftsmanship earned their respect. They traded tobacco for carved wooden figurines or hand-sewn gloves. Friendships, forbidden by regulation, formed in quiet gestures. One guard later recalled shaking hands with a German sergeant at the war's end, both in tears. "We both lost something," he said, "but maybe we both learned something too." By April 1945, as the news of Hitler's death spread, the camp fell into stunned silence. For hours no one spoke. When the American commander addressed the prisoners, he said simply, "Gentlemen, the war in Europe is over." No cheers followed, only the sound of wind against the wire. Some prisoners knelt in prayer, others stared at the horizon, unsure whether to feel relief or shame. Their self-governing camp had outlasted the regime that built them, but the story was not over. The Americans began preparing for repatriation. Each prisoner would soon return to a Germany in ruins, a homeland that no longer resembled the one they had left. Before departure, the camp's council met one last time. They drafted a final statement. "We have learned that order without humanity is tyranny, and freedom without order is chaos. Between these lies the duty of men." That message, carried back across the Atlantic by men who had once marched for Hitler, would seed quiet change in post-war Germany, a democracy born unexpectedly behind barbed wire. And though the fences at Herne would one day be torn down, the memory of that strange self-governing camp would remain, proof that even enemies, when given dignity, could rediscover their humanity. The war ended, but Camp Herne's legacy was just beginning to echo across oceans and decades. As the summer of 1945 dawned, trains began to arrive to take the German prisoners home. The prairie air carried the smell of oil and dust as American guards lined up to say farewell. For months they had lived side by side with the men they once fought, men who now spoke English, read American newspapers, and sang songs of peace in the evenings. Many guards were reluctant to see them go. They shook hands, traded addresses, even exchanged small gifts, a carved figurine, a folded flag patch, a photograph. Behind those gestures lay an unspoken truth that something profound had happened behind the wire. The Germans boarded the trains with mixed hearts. For some, captivity had been punishment. For others, revelation. They had entered as servants of the Reich and left as students of democracy. When the locomotives hissed to life and the Texas horizon began to fade, many prisoners realized they were leaving not just a camp, but a lesson. In that strange corner of America, they had glimpsed what a free society looked like when stripped to its essence: fairness, law, and the quiet dignity of respect. For men who had known only tyranny, that was the most powerful education imaginable. When they arrived in Germany, the shock of reality was brutal. Cities were ashes, families scattered. The Reich had collapsed into rubble and guilt. Returning POWs found themselves distrusted by their own people, too Americanized, some said. Yet among them, especially those from Camp Herne, a quiet current of change flowed. They spoke of fairness in command, of voting on council decisions, of learning from American engineers and farmers. Some became teachers, mayors, and reformers in the new West Germany. One former sergeant from Herne helped draft municipal charters in Lower Saxony. Another organized worker councils that mirrored the camp's democratic structure. It was as if the seeds planted behind the barbed wire had taken root in the ruins of the Reich. In Washington, officials reflected on the success of their unorthodox approach. Reports from the Provost Marshal General's office noted that America's humane treatment of POWs had yielded unexpected dividends. The self-governing system had kept order with minimal force, and more importantly, it had turned enemies into witnesses of democracy. Some policymakers quietly suggested that this method could serve as a blueprint for post-war reconstruction. They were right. Many of the ideas tested at Herne, local autonomy, structured debate, civic education, would later influence Allied re-education programs in occupied Germany. What began as an experiment in logistics had become a quiet weapon in the war for hearts and minds. Inside Germany, those lessons rippled outward. The Federal Republic, founded in 1949, emerged with an emphasis on civic responsibility, decentralized power, and community-led governance. Former POWs who had tasted self-rule in America championed these ideals. A few even returned to the United States in the 1950s, visiting the old campgrounds, now overgrown with grass and silence. They stood where the barracks once stood and whispered prayers of gratitude. Some wrote letters to their former guards, thanking them for kindness shown in a time when the world forgot mercy. The irony was striking. Prisoners of war had found freedom first. Meanwhile, in the towns surrounding Herne, the story became legend. Locals told their children that the Germans built a town of their own behind fences. Farmers remembered how disciplined and polite the prisoners had been, how they worked long hours without complaint. One widow recalled a German mechanic repairing her water pump and refusing payment, saying simply, "It's enough to feel useful again." Decades later, when historians visited Herne, they found fading carvings in tree trunks, initials, dates, and a few lines in German poetry, reminders of a time when the enemies of war became the craftsmen of peace. Psychologists later studied the Herne experiment as a case of moral inversion. Captors, transforming captives through trust rather than domination. They found that autonomy, even limited, restored dignity faster than punishment ever could. The prisoner's internal hierarchy had initially mirrored the Reich's rigid control, but exposure to freedom had eroded that structure from within. By the time repatriation began, the once fanatical order had dissolved into open discussion, reflection, and even remorse. A few confessed crimes to U.S. chaplains, seeking absolution they could never find at home. The transformation was not instant, but it was real. It proved that humanity, when given a fragment of light, could rebuild itself from darkness. The engineers and officers who designed the POW program also left their mark. Figures like Major General Archer Lurch and Colonel Ralph Tate emphasized that discipline and decency could coexist. They coordinated with organizations like the YMCA, the Red Cross, and local universities to maintain educational programs even during resource shortages. It was an act of faith in civilization itself, to fight barbarism without becoming barbaric. The camp's success stood as quiet evidence that the ideals printed in America's founding documents were not just rhetoric, but strategy. Years later, when historians examined Allied records, they found a striking note in an internal army memorandum. "In treating our enemies as men, we have won their minds." It was a lesson that would shape the coming Cold War, where ideological influence mattered as much as nuclear power. The US realized that the true battlefield was not in tanks or trenches, but in values and perception. Herne had proven that even in captivity, freedom could be contagious. Yet the story carried its share of tragedy too. Not every prisoner left reformed. Some returned home bitter, feeling their experience had stripped them of pride. A few joined extremist movements in post-war Germany, unable to reconcile defeat with dignity. But they were the minority, and the greater legacy belonged to those who carried a quieter conviction that strength without compassion is weakness, and authority without justice is tyranny. These men helped shape a generation that rebuilt Europe not as conquerors, but as partners in peace. By the 1970s, Camp Herne was little more than a memory. Grass grew over the foundations, the guard towers rusted, and the Texas wind erased the footprints of those who had walked behind its fences. But the legacy endured in letters, diaries, and interviews. Former prisoners spoke fondly of the camp's strange democracy. They remembered voting under watchtowers, debating politics by lantern light, and learning English from men they once swore to kill. "We came to America as soldiers," one veteran said in a 1982 interview, "and we left as men who finally understood freedom, Today, only fragments remain, cracked foundations, rusted nails, and the ghosts of conversations that once bridged two worlds. Yet the spirit of that place still resonates wherever former enemies choose dialogue over vengeance. It reminds us that civilization is not measured by victory, but by mercy. The barbed wire that once divided men became, in hindsight, a classroom of humanity. In modern conflicts, generals and policymakers still cite the Hearn principle that respect can achieve what coercion cannot. The world has changed, but the lesson endures, even in war. The treatment of one's enemy defines the future more than any battle ever will. And so, when the sun sets over the fields of central Texas, the wind still whispers across the land that once held captives who discovered freedom behind fences. In that haunting silence lies a truth born of war's darkest hours, that the most enduring victory is not the one won by force, but the one that awakens the conscience of mankind.